All that mold and pollen that's in New York is apparently getting getting blown around by the wind all the way to Maine, because almost half of Maine's medical marijuana may contain mold and pesticides, they say. Two studies have found contaminants in a high percentage of medical cannabis samples in Maine. Vern Molluck of the state's Office of Cannabis Policy said 127 samples were tested recently, and 45% failed for yeast, mold, and pesticides. In a quote, it says, "It's alarming because that it's so high," Malik said. And B, I think it's alarming because folks don't know, and I think folks assume that what they're buying from a regulated market is tested and is free of contamination like this. And it's simply not the case, he says. Another study by Nova Analytics Lab found 20% of 1,400 samples failed for pesticides. Lab officials said the actual rate is likely higher because the testing was voluntary. And unlike the state's adult use market, there is no mandated testing for medical cannabis. Officials with Maine's Office of Cannabis Policy said the legislature should give them the authority to require testing and tracking, they say. So it sounds like more regulation is going to be coming down the pipeline for all of our friends over there in Maine. But that's pretty much the story. It's short and sweet. And I'm going to turn it over to these doctors in the room to see what they happen to think about this. What do you guys think? All this contaminated weed.
Well, it's more than testing, right? It's whether the testing shows that the product is dangerous, public health concerns, because everything has mold on it. We have mold. So
And
it's just really about.
I was going to say, because penicillin is still mold, correct, Dr. Talleyrand?
It's a product of mold.
There we go. It's a product of mold. So we got
right, but it's made synthetically in the lab now. It's not made from mold.
Interesting.
Actually, they use bacteria to make it, I think.
Oh, do they still? I know there are a bunch of drugs that they use bacteria to make.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a more efficient than the chemical synthesis. So this is like really alarming, because if there's anyone that needs pesticide-free and microbe-free cannabis, it's medical patients. Why would they allow medical program with no testing, but they have a recreational program where they have testing that's required, heavy metals and microbes and solvents and whatnot? It seems like the medical patients should have those safeguards as well. So that just doesn't make sense at all. But Dr. Talleyrand is absolutely right. We live in a microbial world, man. I mean, there's microbes everywhere, and
I feel like we need
even where they're not supposed to exist, they exist. So there's no stretch that they're on cannabis. They're probably on food we eat. Like Dr. Talleyrand said, his question is do they represent a hazard? If these folks are using pesticides to knock molds down, that tells you that they're treating the symptom and not the cause, right? Because their growing practices or techniques are such that they're letting a hefty spore load get into their growth, and they're getting PM. So what do? They don't want to not be able to sell that herb that they're producing, that it's costing them a lot of money. So they pray and they spray, or maybe they spray and then they pray.
I think they spray and then pray. That would be my that would what I would do. But I feel like
so you're hoping that the level of contamination is going to be low enough, and it's going to overcome the colonization of your plants with these molds and mildews, which are also going to hit cannabinoid production. So moldy plants or plants that are infected with PM will have lower levels of THC and all the other cannabinoids and terpenes as well.
Mm-hmm. You know how you said we're living in a macro world? I feel like we need to do a remake, like a public education campaign to educate the general public. And I feel like we need to do a remake of the No Doubt song, "I'm Just a Girl," and just redo that to "I'm Just a Girl Living in a Microbial World." and come up with a little science twist to help educate the general public on that, Dr. Mark.
Yeah, I mean, it's
You know,
difficult to keep these spores out of grows. It's difficult to keep them out of packaging operations. You know, we walk around this operation with hair nets and beard nets, and I have to put booties on my shoes. We just try to do everything we possibly can to minimize any kind of contamination of products intended for human consumption. That's it.
You were about to say something, Dr. Talleyrand?
we need to, the regulators need to be proactive rather than reactive,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that they should be doing studies to understand what the best standards are. And perhaps there are studies already to give us some clues around this from previous, from other products, but cannabis is relatively new. I mean, we're just taking it out of the, illegal market and regulating it. So we've got a lot to learn. And rather than to make rules that don't make sense, let's create standards based on science.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I mean, like, and it baffles me. I'm agreeing with you guys as far as like, why do we have such stringent testing on adult use cannabis, but not on medical cannabis? Because I would feel that the onerous of barrier should be higher in the medical field if we're calling it a medicine and treating sick people with it. But it just baffles me because the similar situation is a story that I covered yesterday about New York, where they are not they have pulled all of the mold and bacteria testing in regards to, because none of the product will pass it, and so therefore they would have no product on the shelf if they still had those testing rules in place.
Exactly. So that's a standard problem, right?
Well,
Their standards may have been too high.
I think it's a regulatory problem because they only allowed for outdoor weed to be cultivated, and they didn't allow for anyone to actually have a controlled environment for indoor cannabis production. And so therefore they are contaminating their supply chain by only allowing for that type of cultivation.
That seems a bit backwards, right?
Why does it seem backwards?
That they're only allowing outdoor cultivation and not indoor cultivation.
I agree with you,
would
Dr.
think
T.
that there would be more,
Especially in the Northeast where it snows half the year, you would think that they would want to have some indoor cultivation. But from my understanding, I know that the New York power grid is extremely strained, and I feel like if they had large scale grows on it, I feel like that was just going to be the icing on the cake to just shut the whole power grid down.
or they need to rely on California.
Oh man, you rely on California for anything. I feel sorry for you. Oh man. Oh, there he is. There's Yarrow. It's so nice of you to join us today, Yarrow. Oh,
I am so sorry.
It's gonna be all right, bro. It's
It'll be all
Friday.
right, bro.
It's Friday, Yarrow. You know what I mean? Tomorrow's Saturday. You get to sleep in tomorrow, not today, okay?
Fair enough.
Fair enough. All right. Any other thoughts on these doctors on all this contaminated product in Maine or anything? Because Maine is supposed to have some of the best weed on the East Coast.
Well, I just want to say what is intuitively obvious, but maybe not well known, which is there are no fungicides approved for use on cannabis by the fungicide manufacturers. States have patchworked, lists together, but I mean, there are no approved chemical treatments for insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, miticides for cannabis. You can't apply any of these things, and really, truly, cannabis shouldn't need to have any of these things applied to it. None of those things are lawful to apply according to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. In order for those to be applied to cannabis lawfully, the company that basically registers the active ingredient would have to do a safety, efficacy, and environmental fate study of that active ingredient to show that that active ingredient, when applied according to directions, is capable of controlling the pathogen while posing no threat to the environment or to human consumption. That simply just hasn't been done for anything applied to cannabis. And until something like that is done by a company that owns a registration for one of those active ingredients, this is all, as our good friend would say, pissing up a rope.
Oh man. I mean,
I'm wondering if this is an effect of large grows versus smaller grows. If their standards off because large grows are not as controlling the product as much as smaller grows.
oh yeah, because they don't have as many hands to tend to the plant. Basically, what you're saying, Dr. T, is because
Right?
they're just,
Harder to
yeah. I mean,
control that result.
It,
Exactly.
it definitely is, and when you have an outbreak of powder mold or something like that, and you have these massive grows, it's just like wildfire. It just spreads and spreads and spreads. So I do understand exactly what you're saying about that. That does make a lot of sense and could be a variable factor in this equation as well.